Thanks everyone for coming tonight. I know that there's always a lot going on in town, and to get people to come out for a meeting is there's a lot of competing ones. I know there's even another one in the library tonight. So appreciate you coming out tonight to talk about this. We want to make sure we have an opportunity to discuss with the community the issue around short-term rentals and get some feedback from you all as we move forward with how to regulate this. I did want to do a little bit of introductions. Again, I'm Steve Magoon, Community Development Planning Director and Assistant Town Manager. I know we also have some elected officials here, Council President Mark Sedaris, also Councilor Vinnie Picciarelli, and Councilor Carolyn Bays, and I think that's it. Oh, Councilor Donato, yep, I'm sorry. And Councilor Woodland was here, but I think he snuck out to go to the other meeting. And hopefully I didn't miss anybody else. But again, thank you all for coming out tonight. Have several staff people here also, Gideon Schreiber, Senior Planner, and Andrea Adams, Senior Planner in the back, Zoning Enforcement Officer Mike Mena, and Code Enforcement Officer Tony Mancini, also here with us. One of the things I want to mention is we also had in the back just a half-page form with a couple of questions on it. Anytime we have a public forum, some people are more comfortable speaking in a group. Some people aren't so comfortable with that. So anybody who felt the need or maybe even thought of something afterwards, there's the form for you to also provide us some input. We'll also put that up on the website and make that available too, so people could fill that out afterwards if they wanted to. So for tonight's agenda, a couple things we're going to do. We're going to talk a little bit about what short-term rentals are, just to make sure everybody's on the same page in terms of what we're talking about. Talk about some of the potential impacts, both positive and negative. Talk about the current zoning situation in Watertown, as well as some examples of some other communities and what they're doing in terms of regulating short-term rentals. And then have just an open discussion, an open conversation with everyone here, hopefully providing opportunity for you all to give us some feedback, talk about some of your thoughts about issues or concerns, or even some positive things about this as a use. And maybe just as a little bit of an icebreaker, how many people have stayed in a short-term rental? Well, almost everybody. Anybody had a really bad experience with it? Felt like it just didn't really work out? No? That's good. How about having a bad experience with a neighbor having a short-term rental? No? No issues there? Well, that's good. How many people operate or rent short-term rentals? A couple. Good. Good. So it gives a little bit of a sense of, everybody in the room and where you might come to this issue. Whoops. That didn't work. Whoops. That went too. Okay, so first of all, what is short-term rentals? We're talking about residential properties, and those being used for a short-term rental, usually less than a month. Obviously apartments often are rented for a month at a time, or 6-month lease or year lease. So we're talking about things that are shorter than that, similar to a hotel room, but on the second bullet could be a much smaller unit, could be portions of a building, could only be even a room. And that's one of the things that's unique about the sharing economy that spawned this whole idea of short-term rentals. Is it's really not taking that standard model of a hotel room of, this is a room in a building of rooms that you rent. Instead, it's really gotten down to people renting a couch or a bed. I'm not using it, so somebody else can for the night. So it really spans that whole spectrum, and once it got some traction and started going, there have been people who've taken advantage of that concept, and again, getting to the third bullet about owner-occupied, which is the most common one, but also investors have gotten into this industry. In some cases in Boston, where they've taken a whole apartment building and just rent out all the units as short-term rentals, and have found that profitable enough that they don't offer them up to rent to people for longer terms. There's also a model with multiple units with an on-site manager. Owner-occupied or not owner-occupied seems to be an important distinction. The length of the rental can also be an important distinction for a lot of the regulations. So to try and put it in a little bit of context for Watertown, obviously Boston is a pretty important regional destination for a lot of reasons. Obviously tourism, very important in Boston. I was talking to someone, I was just in Maryland this weekend, and was talking to someone, and they were talking about coming to Boston, and they really like to, but the hotel rooms are just so expensive, and obviously this is, in some cases, a response to that. I think one of the things that's interesting about it as it's expanded as an industry is you get a broad range. Again, you could rent someone's bedroom, obviously that'd probably be less expensive than a hotel room, or you can rent a whole house, which is going to be more expensive than a bedroom, but obviously fits the need and is a much more broader spectrum of opportunities. So that creates, opportunities for renters. And again, in Boston, we're talking about a lot of tourism, also a hub for universities, hospitals. People come from pretty far and wide for some of those types of uses in this region and looking for places to stay. Obviously, a lot of meetings and conferences, and also family coming with people coming to the Boston region for those reasons and wanting to add on, opportunity to stay here and experience the region. So, why do we care about short-term rentals? Well, a couple of things that have been important. Obviously, it's here. We have it. There's a lot of short-term rentals that exist in town, and even a couple of people that came tonight who've been participating in that industry. And that's important for both users and renters. People providing the space as well as people who want to rent it. And obviously that provides some benefits, as we already talked a little bit about, but also has created some concerns and some complaints in the community. We've gotten a number of them, and we need to deal with that aspect of this as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons. So some of the potential benefits of this as a use, again, provides a choice for residents, people coming to the region, extended family, creates more options for businesses and other visitors who come to the region, for a variety of reasons, which is important, when they're looking for places to stay. Creates an income source for homeowners. If you have a large home and maybe you're an empty nester, there comes a decision point of, I have a lot more space than I need. It's expensive to keep up. It's expensive for property taxes. One of the options is to downsize and move out, but this is obviously another option. Take advantage of that space and make it generate some income. Creates options for increased income for the homeowners, obviously, which I just said. Enhances town as a destination. Again, people have a variety of needs when they're looking for a place to stay, and having those available within the community can help enhance it as a destination for people who are traveling. Has the potential for tax revenues, as well as application and inspection fees. This could be a pretty substantial revenue source, and to its credit, Airbnb has said, we welcome regulation, and we welcome providing tax revenue to municipalities for the use, and I think that's important. The tax revenue we can't do on our own. That's something the legislature's dealing with, which I'll get to in just a minute. Opportunity to bring regulation and predictability to customers, both customers and to the industry. One of the things that I think is important about the last bullet, creating a level playing field. As a hotel, you're regulated and pay revenues to the state and the municipality, and is it really fair to have other people who just decide one day that they're going to rent space and haven't really gone through any process of making sure the space is appropriate, has the requisite attributes that make it appropriate to rent. So it's important to, regulating this industry would provide an opportunity to create a level playing field for all the users. Some of the negative impacts or potential problems. One of the big ones is it can reduce the number of available long-term housing units. So if it's more profitable for me as an apartment owner to rent it out in short-term rentals, then I'm not going to make that available to rent to the market for a housing unit. Second bullet, and obviously having less of those units available can increase rents and reduce the amount of affordable housing available. And that's an important impact. The city of Boston's considering regulations for this industry, and they've really focused on that aspect of it, that is going to, or has taken away a significant number of residential units from the open market and therefore reduce the amount of affordable housing available. It does have the potential for increased traffic and parking issues. I know one of the complaints that we got here in Watertown was an example of someone renting out a house through Airbnb and having a large party. Obviously, if that happens, you're talking about a lot of people coming to that one house. And as a residential house, it didn't have the parking available for that kind of an impact. Community character issues, noise, trash, transit use in the residential area, all those things are potential impacts if it's not regulated and doesn't have any opportunity to deal with those issues on a case-by-case basis and make sure that they're appropriately handled. Safety concerns, again, some of these uses might go into a residential house or apartment that maybe was constructed many, many years ago, and some of the safety minimum code requirements may not exist. Is there adequate means of egress for each of those units? Is there smoke alarms and the types of things that would make sure that it can have that number of people staying there and done in a safe and appropriate manner? And the last one on this sheet, increased staff resources, review and inspection. One of the important things for me in talking about this issue is if we decide to regulate it and permit it, what kind of responsibility does that then put on the town? If we've given a permit for the use, there's safety code issues. Is that, give people an expectation that we've expected that and that a house does meet those standards? If one pops up on Airbnb tomorrow and we haven't had a chance to inspect it, is there an expectation that exists? And so I think it's important that we address that issue as we move forward, but also the volume could be significant, and the amount of time and staff time that's going to take to make sure that we stay on top of that could be significant. So what's the current situation in Watertown? It's not specifically defined in our zoning ordinance. We had, again, some complaints about some existing users, and so we decided to regulate that with the most appropriate, most similar use in the ordinance, which under 502A is an accessory use, was a dwelling unit that's owner-occupied, renting of not more than 2 rooms as a lodging without separate cooking facilities and for not more than 2 lodgers. Maybe that specific situation would fit some of those. That obviously doesn't fit the breadth of issues that this industry is dealing with. We kind of put it under that. One of the complainants that are properties that was complained about challenged our putting it in that zoning category and appealed that to the Zoning Board of Appeals and said, no, we don't think that the town should regulate us that way, and we shouldn't be regulated at all. We should be able to go ahead and do this. That went to the Zoning Board of Appeals, which denied that and agreed with the zoning enforcement officer that they should be regulated. The second complainant, not complaining, person who got complained about, decided to try and apply under this provision. That went to the planning board, and the planning board said, no, nice try, staff, but that doesn't really fit. And so we got to the third bullet where the planning board said, this really doesn't fit. It's really not properly defined in our zoning ordinance. This is a complicated and broad issue, and until it's really dealt with in our regulations, it's not a use that's permitted in town, and therefore we're not going to move forward with that until we deal with it more directly. So one of the things I wanted to touch on briefly is potential state legislation, because there is several efforts in the legislature to deal with this industry a little more specifically. And House Bill 3454 is one example of those. It would define short-term rental. One of the important things I think in this bill is the distinction between various types of rentals. So it would separate a owner-occupied situation that did not rent a lot of days out of the year versus investor-owned properties or ones that aren't owner-occupied. It does provide for charging excise tax similar to hotel rooms. So again, it levels the playing field a bit there. And it would give us the ability to restrict the number of units or the number of days that you would be able to rent a unit. It did require, this particular bill did require that you designate 50% of the new tax revenue to affordable housing, and would require annual safety inspection of the units as well as insurance. Again, that's a proposed legislation that hasn't passed, so that's still speculative. Also wanted to touch a little bit on what some other communities are doing. Most of what I'm going to talk about next is really Massachusetts situations, but some have decided, no, we don't want to deal with this, so we're just not going to allow it. I think the big problem with that is enforcement, because again, these things pop up daily, and having the ability to stay on top of that and truly, prevent those from operating is a huge issue, a huge challenge. So I think that's sort of more of the put the head in the sand approach of we're just going to pretend it's not here, as opposed to regulating. Others have developed a registration or permitting process. I think one of the important aspects again is to define what short-term rentals are when you decide to go that route. They do have health and safety requirements, again dealing with some of the noise and trash type, parking type issues, as well as a registration or license requirement that has inspections that would deal with some of the fire code and building code issues, as well as health code. There are some aspects of these that I think operate more similar to a bed and breakfast, where they're providing meals or sharing meals and things like that, which then gets the health department involved as well. There are some more specific restrictive options that some jurisdictions have included, things like limiting the duration of the stay or the total number of days in a year. One of the things that Boston was looking at is limiting the number of days in a year to try and prevent investor properties. Unfortunately, I think the last provision I saw was 90 days out of the year, and apparently some of the investors in Boston said, well, all right, that's worth it. We'll leave it empty the rest of the time, and financially, it's better to us to rent 90 days out of the year than to rent it as an apartment, which is kind of interesting, but also a number of people or rentals within a dwelling unit. Obviously, if you could have some larger buildings, you could have a whole host of rentals within that same building. So it gives us, some jurisdictions have looked at that as a way to regulate it. Probably the most often referred to one is owner occupancy, whether that's something that as a municipality you want to acquire or not. Obviously, that also deals with the investor aspect of it. And then finally, defining where to allow the use, and that again gets into parking things, zoning, those types of requirements. And just as an example, some of the ones, again, I mentioned Boston, which is looking at regulations. Cambridge, Belmont, Brookline, Newton, they all have existing regulations that deal with this as a use. The graphic there is a an example of Cambridge's short-term rental guide, which I think is pretty comprehensive. Interestingly enough, at least a couple of big cities, San Diego and New York City, have decided, at least so far, to not allow that as a use. So that brings us to an opportunity for conversation with all of you. Ideas, issues, concerns, benefits, or other thoughts. We want to have an interactive conversation with you who've come out tonight so that we can help us move forward to the next steps. Russ.
I see this as running a business in a residential area,
Yeah.
okay? And to the best of my knowledge, without permission and so forth, you're not supposed to be able to run a business out in a residential area here in Watertown. Now, I have a lot of safety concerns also. One is, how do you have an effective neighborhood watch when you have all kinds of transient people in the neighborhood not knowing who they are, what they're there for, or anything else? And I believe that this creates more problems than it solves. And as far as regulation is concerned, I think you could put an end to this by, I don't know, you might have to go to legislature to get permission here, but anyone that's gonna run a business like that in Watertown, and it's in a residential area, then the fine should be $10,000. And I'll tell you what, the difference between someone that owns property and someone that owns nothing, someone that has no assets, whatever, there's not much you can do with them. They can get away with a lot of stuff. But anybody that owns property, you can easily put a lien against that property. The town has every right under police power to do that. And I don't see any good reason why we should allow something like this in the town of Watertown. Period.
And unfortunately, I think you came in after the slide about the positives. But fair enough.
Hey, listen, anybody that's gonna make money, to them, there's always positives.
Sure, yes.
Right now, do you know how many people are using, how many short-term rental businesses there are
Sure.
in Watertown?
And I wouldn't say I have a definitive number.
Yeah.
I can tell you, because it changes regularly, somebody might decide to rent it because I'm going out of town for a month, so I'll put it up on Airbnb, come back next month and it's not there, so, it kind of varies. I'd say at any given time, there's, 10, 15, or 20 of them available in Watertown.
Oh, no, I'd say.
More than that. Much more than that.
I have numbers. Last time I looked, that's what I thought. Fair enough.
100.
Okay, hundreds.
As
Hundreds.
an operator, how many do you think?
I have a report.
Oh, okay, good, thank you.
At the time when my case came up, one of the reports we ran showed, I think 44, 45 Airbnb listings within the category of full unit rental. That's not counting people who would put a bedroom on
Yep.
it.
Okay,
So 45, and again, it changes depending on who lists on.
Sure. Yep.
45 full unit rentals.
Is this apartments or private houses? Or
Yeah, so a full
apartment
unit
buildings?
is like an address, like if you were to rent an apartment. So it could be a whole house, it could be a single family home,
Or
or it could be a
apartment?
unit in a multi-family.
yep,
And there's a lot of other platforms as well. I mean,
Yep.
everyone focuses on Airbnb, but there's college apps for sharing. There's a lot of different mechanisms, and they're not always the same units that are being advertised. So it's like if you have a finished apartment that's available for someone to use, there's different places that people are advertising them. So-
And then if you add in the spare rooms for rent, I have no idea how many of those are there.
okay. Counselor?
I just wanted to say, just in terms of saying that we wouldn't do it, I know people in San Diego and in New York who are doing
Carol, would you
Airbnb.
speak up a bit? 'Cause
I know people in San Diego and in New York who are doing Airbnb regularly, and there's nobody,
Sure.
so it is a very difficult thing to regulate. But the other thing I wanted to know is, are there ordinances around bed and breakfast, which seems like the closest, in some ways, some of the closer, thing, and have you looked at those kinds of regulations?
Sure, and because that's has been a specific use similar to a hotel or motel, I think it's been pretty clear how jurisdictions have regulated that through zoning. Because this is one that kind of spans the spectrum from, again, a bedroom, which is not a separate unit, it's not, you know, it doesn't have some of those attributes to it, to a whole building, you know, it's a little more difficult to be as, you know, to put it in the category of bed and breakfast. I think it's a little broader than that. Now, we could decide to regulate it and make it more like a bed and breakfast type regulation, where we're saying the only way it's allowed is if it is, you know, meets these certain criteria. But again, that's one of the things we want to consider and have more conversation about. Yes?
I counted over 100 Airbnb alone within Watertown the last time I checked. My question is this: if we get a regulatory scheme, either statutory or by ordinance, and it seems to work, how does this impact the assessed values of the properties that are under the short-term rental system? Is this going to benefit the town in some way?
Well, certainly if we get to the point where we can collect a room tax similar to what we do with hotel rooms,
Yeah.
that will definitely be a
The
financial
excise
benefit
is
to
easy,
them.
but what about the
Right.
assessment?
Assessment, I don't know, that's a good question, and I'm not sure how the assessor would evaluate that. And at least it strikes me that it might be different in terms of the nature of the rental. You know, again, if I'm an investor and I'm renting that out, you know, I'd like to rent it out 365 days a year, that's bringing a much greater return than it would if it's just rented as an apartment.
But
On the other hand, if I'm renting a room in my house, or if I'm renting, you know, something on the weekend, once or twice a year, clearly that's not creating a dramatic change in value of the property. So I don't know.
I was gonna just add, I mean, from a perspective of the building and the use, like a two-family is a two-family either way. And so, you know, I work with the mapping, not the assessing, but I imagine from a use perspective, whether it's being used for renting to, you know, whether the room is available or the space is available for a rental, short-term or long-term, or is owned as a condo, there's not a lot of difference in how that's treated. I suspect.
Certainly something to consider though. Gloria?
Yeah, but Gideon, in Watertown, the rule is no more than 4 unrelated people. I happen to have a fairly large 2-family. If I want to count up how many people I can stick in that house, it'd be more like 10. That certainly has impact on my neighborhood. There's several concerns that I think we have here. We go from hotel to motel to bed and breakfast, which are all regulated. You can go to a boarding house. I don't know if we have anything on the books with regard to that, Steve, or not. Then you have what are called tourist homes, where people rent out rooms. And then we get into this really murky area. This is an underground economy in many ways. People can list on Airbnb for 90 days. They take it off. Now they go list on for rent by owner, and they change the description a little bit, or they go list on home away. So the regulation issue is quite complicated. It's great that Airbnb says, oh yeah, we want to do this, we want to go legit. Taxes, they don't pay any taxes to the communities. It's the person that's renting and the person that is renting the room and the person that owns the room. So there are a lot more layers to this than we're talking about. Insurance-wise, many insurance companies will not insure this. That's another issue. My sister is in the risk management business. You can lose your home insurance for this kind of thing, or you have to get a special policy. Now, is Watertown supposed to start regulating all this? And then there's the other one, which is, I've been a wonderful Airbnb customer for you. I left the place better than I found it, and you say to me, you know, when you want to come back in town again, you don't have to go through Airbnb, just call me directly, and we'll work it out. Now it's off the books. So I'm not saying I have the answers, but I've been reading about this for quite a while. It's destroyed neighborhoods in New Orleans with speculation and investors. We are talking out of one side of our mouth about affordable housing and what we need to do in our community, and yet we have 100 Airbnbs going on at all different levels. I'm not sure what the answer is, but it's complicated. And I've researched Rhode Island, Maine, Vermont is dealing with this, and various communities in Massachusetts.
Well, and I think that points up to the same point that I think most of what this presentation was about, which is we need to decide how we want to do it.
Right, and the only other point I would want to make, Steve, is if somebody has a and they're looking for some extra income, why not rent to a teacher or a nurse or somebody in the community that is able then to be in quote affordable housing in a nice neighborhood as part of the neighborhood? Because now we have another avenue then, but it's kind of more legitimized. The other thing is, do neighbors get to be informed that now they've got Airbnbs all over their street and in their neighborhood? Some places regulated, there can be only so many Airbnbs within so many miles.
Well, that's something we can
Right,
consider.
it's a lot.
You know,
It's a lot.
and if we decide to permit it, you know, what kind of permitting process do we want to have? Is it something where they simply register and go through the process to make sure it meets the criteria and they can do it? Or is it, you know, something that's discretionary on the part of the town, where we can say, yeah, we approve that and find that okay, or not? You know, I think those are important questions that we need to think about. Counselor?
We have a couple of our enforcement officers here this evening. From what I've read about these types of short-term rentals, you would have to hire at least another full-time person to search these sites every single day for coming up with, you know, is something new popped up today? I mean, it's gonna become extreme. We have to be very careful about how many resources we're gonna be putting forth in regulating this type of industry. I can see, you know, us needing plenty of people to help us.
I think one of the good things is that at least some of the platforms would work with us if we decide to do that, to regulate it and permit it, and wouldn't just allow somebody to put a site up on their site if it wasn't permitted by the municipality. I'm not sure all of them will do that, would police their own users that way, but at least some would, and I think that would help a lot. But you're right, if there is no cooperation there amongst the platforms, we could have multiple people spend all their time doing nothing but chasing these down.
Could we, as a community, force them to do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly something we can look
And
at.
there is a new company springing up now that does go through and troll through to see whether people are jumping sites and doing that. It's a secondary business. And we're talking about that one.
Yes.
David Fagan, Martin Street. So I was the one case that was actually enforced on, so I stopped running mine. I prefer to run my business above ground, so it's hard to find them, they can pop up. A lot of us, you could find us if the town actually said, we're going to actually address this, we want to work with you, come to us, let's all work together, let's have a registration. I would have been there. I didn't register because there was nowhere to register,
Sure,
right?
absolutely.
I was in violation of a zoning law, which had never been enforced before. That was the first case. Okay. I did have insurance for short-term rental. In terms of if I were to do a side deal with a customer who paid when to come back, I would still be registered with the town, and I would still be carrying the same insurance. I mean, I wouldn't be giving Airbnb their fee, which I'm fine with, frankly.
But would you be giving the town their excise fee if there was
That's
a
true.
cost?
Yes, that's
Let's
a
be
good point. That's
honest.
a really good point. As far as excise fees and the concerns in terms of affordable housing, I am concerned about affordable housing in Watertown. I have a 25-year-old son who just moved back from school, and he said, I need a place to live, and I said, well, you can't afford my apartment, actually. Good luck. I was pleased to see that some of the excise tax would be specifically channeled toward affordable housing. I'll be frank about this. Airbnb is a cash machine, and that's why it's got so much in it, okay? So that's scary, but on the other hand, there is something which is very powerful, very effective, that is happening in our community. And if we work with it and find a way, hey, let's get some of that money to the town,
Because I
then
understand that you don't live in the community now anymore. do you? You
I live in
another town.
Medford. This is my former home, which I longer been there again. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Russ?
Yeah.
You know, Steve, what I really don't understand here is that there's no question that this is a business. like any other business.
That's just being a landlord.
Which I don't know. First of all, if you're a landlord, then that is a business also.
Right.
That's totally regulated, okay? With a laundry list of laws that almost never end, okay? So you can compare the two, all right? Because there's no comparison when you compare the laws as far as legitimate rentals are concerned. So here we are, we have zoning of residential areas. And why do we have zoning of residential areas? To protect those areas so people can have peace and enjoyment amongst other people in a residential area. So now, we're gonna allow businesses in a residential area. And where do you stop? If you wanna bend over backwards for this business, then what's next? What other businesses are you gonna allow within residential areas? And that's why I don't think this is a good idea. And the other thing is, you know, when I heard the word bed and breakfast, actually, when I go to Italy, I spend time in a bed and breakfast. But the bed and breakfast that I say is in a large apartment complex that the person that owns it owns half of one floor that he rents out at a very reasonable price. But I cannot see us, again, bending over backwards for this and to end up impacting residential neighborhoods here in Watertown. And again, you know, where do you stop once you open up the, and what I was starting to say is that I don't really see the difference between a hotel, motel, or a bed and breakfast as far as people stay there for 1 night, 2 nights a week, or whatever, okay? It's still temporary lodging, no matter what the hell you call it, all right? So I am totally against this. All right? To me, we don't allow rooming houses here in town. If we have any, we might have a handful, I have no idea. But the point is that we don't want rooming houses in our neighborhood. And I don't think we want bed and breakfast, motels, hotels in residential areas here in Watertown.
Well, and so a couple things. First, you said we're bending over backwards to accommodate this industry, and we're not. What we're having is a conversation about how we want to regulate it, if at all. So I think that's an important comment in terms of, you know, obviously from your perspective, we shouldn't allow it.
I don't know any other business that has this kind of forum here if you wanted to push in a residential neighborhood. What other business? Anyone can tell me?
So let's talk about that a little bit. You've characterized it as a business similar to a hotel or a motel or a bed and
It is.
breakfast. Well, let me finish.
Easy, Russ. All right, Carla.
Another way you could characterize it is it's the same as renting your apartment. I'm renting it on a shorter term basis, but I'm a landlord and I'm renting my apartment. Why am I going to be treated differently if I want to do it on this forum or this platform as opposed to somebody who's just renting it out for 6 months or a year?
It's just like a rooming house when you do
Well,
that.
Okay, but what I'm saying,
What's the regulation of rooming
what
house
I'm
in
saying,
Watertown?
what I'm saying is you've decided to characterize it in one area, and it could also be characterized another way. And there's different ways we can regulate it so that we could have, or at least mitigate those kinds of impacts that you talked about. Now, and again, we may come to the conclusion we don't want to allow it, but I think at least having a conversation about how we might want to do that is appropriate. Yes?
Yeah, I have concern about these 45 or 50 people that are being used now. I'd like those to be registered someplace now, because I think it's going to be a long time before Watertown works this whole thing out. But I'd like to know who on my street is doing this, and I'd like them to register. If you don't register, you have to register, or else I'm going to complain that something's going on in this house that I know nothing about. And also, you know, when I go to a hotel or a motel or something, they take my personal information. They know who I am, either because I pay by MasterCard or something. But I would hope that the people who rent out these places know something about the people who rent them, or how to get in touch with them, or if they pay cash to the person, which they might very well do, actually.
So in terms of requiring that they all register today,
Yes.
I don't have a form for them to fill out or a place for them to register or a way to require them to do that. I'm not saying
If
it's
they want to
bad.
register.
Well, not for the town.
Right, town doesn't have a way. Even if
So
we
I
wanted
think-
to register.
Exactly. So while I don't have a problem with your idea of let's get this started and get them to register so there's some information about them, I think I'm hard pressed to require that they do that when I don't have a method for doing that. I mean, we could ask them voluntarily to do that, but I'm not sure that really gets us anywhere. As opposed to let's decide how we want to regulate them and come up with that process of either registering or licensing or special permits or however it is we want to do that and get that put in place as quickly as possible. I mean, if you want to know how many are on your street, you can go on the site and look.
And yes, the site doesn't give you the addresses. That's why we can't enforce it. We can't find it.
Oh, you can find
If there's ways, but
Yes.
I have a couple, I actually have a question. So on the enforcement side, Steve, what's sort of been going on to date? Are you actively pursuing enforcement? Are you still receiving complaints? Are you on Airbnb saying, oh my God, what are we gonna do? Just kind of
Yeah.
like, or are you just kind of focusing on this aspect of it now?
We have been dealing with this on a complaint basis, and I would say since the planning board said, no, how you characterize it really doesn't fit, we've been more focused on, okay, how are we gonna regulate it? Let's have this forum, let's get this set up, have a conversation with the community, and decide how to move forward.
I think just to kind of talk out loud a little bit, this is something that's here, it's happening a lot of places, and I'm sure even in the towns where it's not allowed, it's probably happening illegally anyways, just like any other use in zoning that zoning professionals and planning professionals deal with on a daily basis. But the idea of it not being regulated, it does concern me, and I think that to not address it and regulate it and just say we're not gonna allow it, it's still gonna happen. So that's really not making anything any better. My concerns come with how many in a certain neighborhood, those types of issues, because you could end up with concentrations in certain neighborhoods where everything is sort of being rented in that manner. And then I started to think about situations, I was talking to one of my coworkers today of a situation of maybe a two-family and someone's living on one floor and they rent the unit, and then all of a sudden they have somebody completely different in and out above them every day. And is that something that they knew about? Is that something they're okay with? So I tend to put it out there, get it out front, make it known, this is where they are, this is what's gonna be tolerated, this isn't what's gonna be tolerated, and taking it to the level of a special permit and bringing in that discretion, because I do think that there are certain properties in certain neighborhoods where this might not necessarily work. I'll take a situation of homes that allow Airbnbs that allow you to bring a car that have tandem driveways. Explain to me how that would ever work overnight in the winter, where you don't know who's on the second floor, who's on the first floor. Here's my keys, move my car. So there are some logistic issues with certain properties that just are not gonna, fit into this criteria. And then there are other situations where this could exist within the right parameters, within the right conditions, that I don't think would have really any impact whatsoever. But I think the most important part to some of the other comments here today is people kind of need to know what's going on in their neighborhood. And I know things have changed a lot and not everybody knows all their neighbors like they did 20, 30, 40 years ago. But I think it's important to know where these are for the people in the neighborhood and also for town officials and from a public safety standpoint as well. You have a situation in a home, an alarm goes off at night, people aren't sure how to get out, those types of situations, or people are arriving at homes and finding potentially people in the basement. Some of the things that I've seen online are very clear that people have done up their basements, you can tell by the windows, and it looks completely legit, decent price, stay there for a couple nights. Someone calls 911, is the fire department going in the basement? Do they even know people are down there? So those types of things. I think it's an awareness and education, and people tend to be negative about things when they're unsure or even scared or concerned about how it may impact them. But if if the neighborhood is aware that something was vetted, there was a hearing, they were able to ask the questions, hear the information, then they might not be as concerned about it.
Okay, good, thank you.
How many
Yes.
complaints have there been?
Mike, do you know how many?
Mike Menace, zoning enforcement. I've been getting complaints just the last maybe 3 years, and I maybe have maybe 24 or less. I don't have an exact number for you. It's not a frequent every week. We get a phone call, it's, you know, kind of random.
And are the complaints really that something was impacting the person or just that they didn't like it?
Usually it's someone's being impacted. A couple have been where it's a renter or a condo owner in a two-family. Some it's a neighbor. But yeah, it's usually because someone's annoyed with it.
Okay.
I'd like to address what you just said here, where it might be multifamily with, there's a long-term tenant in one, and the other one's being used as an Airbnb. So I actually had both of those situations. I have a two-family. For a time, I had an Airbnb on my first floor unit, and I had my long-term tenant in the upstairs unit. They had, I don't know what was going on. They have to be, I never really got a complaint from them. They actually let me know once when there was a problem, so it was helpful. On the other hand, I think, so I had a professional manager take care of my place, and they had probably 20 others. And they said, frankly, it works better not to mix. They said, if you can do a multifamily as Airbnb, it's easier to have it all Airbnb. That was just his experiences in the market, and if you're thinking about how to handle a mixed situation. And so then I did eventually convert to both being Airbnb for a short period of time.
Jonathan?
I find myself, somewhat sympathetic to the folks who want to be able to rent out rooms or their houses on a short-term basis. But there've been a lot of problems raised here tonight, and it seems to me some of them exist sort of regardless of the residential use. In a residential neighborhood, there can be people who are irresponsible and who have big parties and so on. And it's just it kind of comes with the territory of living in a neighborhood. But the short-term rentals, I'm sure, can make that worse. And it seems to me a number of these problems can be limited, not eliminated, but limited, if there is a cap on the number of days that a property can be, I'll just call it Airbnb, it's easier to say. It doesn't solve it all, but that seems to me it does address the affordable housing issue, and it mitigates a number of the other issues. But I guess one other comment I want to make is about this enforcement concern. It seems to me, as Mark suggested, that that's a real key area in terms of whatever you come up with, how you're going to enforce it. But I guess it also seems to me that whether you just say, well, we're going to just prohibit this because we don't want to deal with it for a variety of reasons, or you say, well, we're going to allow it, but we're going to put these restrictions on it and requirements and reporting and so on. Either way, you've got to enforce it. It's an enforcement problem it's just going to be an enforcement problem in the reality of today.
Sure.
And so my guess is that a lot of the enforcement happens when people drop a dime on their neighbors because it's a problem. And if it's not a problem, if there aren't rowdiness or loud parties or parking problems, then people don't complain to the town, then there's not going to be, again, whether it's just totally prohibited or otherwise, there isn't going to be a short-term rental police that's going out and surveying the town. But I guess I just want to say, either way, there's an enforcement problem, and it's a problem the town has to deal with.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said. I have the concern of the safety of neighbors, safety of the renter, and I'm wondering, do these, people that are in this business, do they ask for the driver's license of the person that, it ought to be the minimum thing that they register also with the city, just like in every hotel, they take the information down, so if there were to be a crime, I don't think one often hears about these kind of things occurring, but it would also mitigate that from happening if the people renting would know that they have to hand over their personal information in case they offer cash or, so.
Okay?
Clarify about that, if a person comes to rent on Airbnb.
Could you speak up, because you're
Sure.
covering your
Yeah.
mouth, so we can't hear you.
If a person comes to rent on Airbnb, Airbnb has vetted them already, so Airbnb has some kind of document, either passport or license or something that's available.
But if it's not through, if it's not through that website, if people just know this person, how do you regulate that?
Well, yeah, so I was just.
When you say you vetted them, okay, I understand that word, but how deep do you go with your vetting? Are you doing a background check, criminal check? No, I'm not saying you
I don't think
should.
they do. They need
Okay,
to
all right.
provide an official document,
Okay.
either in the form of.
Because, always remember, that honest people worry about the pains and penalties of perjury, but dishonest people could care less about it. That's the problem. Right.
I bet them more than my long-term tenants.
Pardon?
I bet them more than my long-term tenants,
Yeah.
All right.
because I
Councilor Plummer?
have more risk there.
Thank you. I don't think I'm saying anything that most people here in the room don't already know. I think it is happening. It continues to happen, and therefore I think we need to address it in some way. So I know, and I don't agree with Russ that we address it by not allowing it. I think we need to address it by regulating it. I'm most concerned about the affordable housing issue. I'm most concerned that we don't have situations where a owner, occupied or not occupied, uses their property and takes it basically off the rental market and puts it into this very, very lucrative process of raising money through short-term rentals. And so I don't know whether that's addressed by limiting how many days it can be done. But I think that, to me, is key, is to figure out that I know that Boston is struggling with this mightily. Their 5-hour hearing didn't produce any resolution to this issue. But we're a much smaller community, and I think we can address it by looking at the number of days that it's happening. Happens. I do also understand that it's a very useful tool for people. When my son was looking for colleges, he and his mom did a lot of Airbnbs for a day, and they just turned over their license and found a place for a day and a half while they were visiting, or for a night. There's issues also with people who need short-term. I have 2 relatives who are visiting nurses. Are what they call temp nurses. And they work for 13 and a half weeks, and then they move on to someplace else. And but to me, the key here is to maintaining the affordable housing issue in Watertown. And then I have a final question. Is the ZBA and the planning board and the town council in violation of the open meeting law tonight?
No.
No, just it was tongue in cheek.
Oh.
ZBA is not.
You're saying there's so many present. I appreciate that. Councilor?
Thank you. I'll just follow up on the comments made by all the others. Our inspectional services, I think, are maxed, and I don't think there's anybody in this room that will dispute that. And others have spoken about the 4 unrelated individuals in a unit, and even that's very difficult to regulate. Inspectional services will go out, look at the lease. There are 4 individuals on that lease. How many individuals actually reside in that particular unit? We have it in our own neighborhoods, and I can attest to the East End. You'd have to monitor the sites 24/7 to know exactly who resides in the unit, irrelevant of whether there are 4 names on the lease or not. Look at all the vehicles. There are significant others, there are extended families, there are distant relatives, you name it. Everybody's got an excuse as to how many people are residing in that particular unit. So enforcement is key. We can't enforce what we currently have on the books. I can't enforce it because I hear from my constituents and pass it on to inspectional services, and it's very, very difficult to enforce. Then how are we going to regulate this? What about parking? Someone else mentioned parking and vehicles and where we're going to put it. It might be appropriate in a single-family area where you know exactly who's going to be there, but in the multifamily units in the East End, very densely populated, almost impossible to regulate because we don't know who's there now. It's just going to complicate the situation. I don't know if anyone saw the Cambridge regulations that were recently enacted. One of my constituents sent it out. I don't know who else was on that email list. I'd be happy to send it out, or Steve, if you could, check their site as well. I don't know if you're familiar with their new regs.
Yep.
Okay, I'm sorry I was delayed.
No problem. Yep, there's nothing different too.
But my concerns are just the same as everybody else's in this room. Would I be supportive at this point in time? Probably not.
We haven't decided what we're gonna come up with first.
Well, my thoughts.
Yeah, David?
It's just a few different comments. First of all, I just want to clarify, earlier we talked about enforcement. Was the suggestion that enforcement would be more of an issue if it was prohibited in town or if it was regulated in terms? So when we were talking about enforcement, do we have a sense of
Well,
which
I
would
think
require?
my point was that if we simply said we're not gonna allow it, that doesn't
Gonna happen.
absolve the enforcement issue. That still is an enforcement issue.
So it was
So I think
it's a
enforcement
prohibition
issue
and
either-
there's an enforcement, but you weren't saying that one was necessarily
No.
going to require more enforcement.
It's not a lot now.
It's an issue with either way.
Right.
So just a few miscellaneous comments. So as was mentioned here, I think one of the aspects of the sort of, I don't know if hidden is the right word, but the hidden nature of it being that if you were going to rent in a place somewhere in Watertown or buy someplace, you wouldn't necessarily know, there wouldn't be something that would be a flag up that says, I'm buying a place that's either next door to a highly utilized Airbnb. So, I mean, obviously there's buyer beware or renter beware, but it would be just another one of those things where in terms of due diligence, you'd have to, it would be something you probably want to know whether the apartment next to you or the house next to you is being rented, that way. One thing that I don't think has been mentioned is the kind of nature of discrimination, whereas in hotels or so forth, there's provision for, say, people with disabilities. There's nothing that requires someone who rents on Airbnb to make the place be accessible to all folks, or discriminate in other means, whether on race basis or otherwise. But so I don't think that was touched on tonight. The other thing was similar to communities. In other words, there are communities that obviously, like New York City, or the high desirable, that these kind of Airbnb type short-term rentals are impacting more than others because of their desirability or expense of trying to rent. And Watertown is probably on the edge, whereas a community like Boylston, Massachusetts, probably isn't wrestling with the problem that Watertown and Cambridge and so forth. But probably even within the community, there's going to be a disproportionate impact. In other words, some areas that are either amenity rich, may have a real high rate of Airbnb, or for example, a large house may have a greater number of people renting it, or to that effect. And just the last thing, I think that Jonathan had mentioned, besides the number of days, probably the single other biggest factor I think that would impact would be just the number of renters or occupants that are allowed. So in addition to the number of days, I would put that as a second factor that would really impact. In other words, if you allow up to 10 people versus limiting it to, say, 4 people or something like that.
All right, thank you. Yes?
I like the idea of limiting it by days, but I wonder if that makes enforcement harder and just kind of drives it underground because you want to do it for more days and you need to be economically feasible. So I just think that's a consideration
Sure.
that you are gonna lose some people that way.
Yep. Good point. Russ?
You know, Steve, this gentleman here brought up an excellent point to the fact that it could affect the value of a property by having a B&B next to it. And actually, it also would put a real estate broker in the position to where they would have to disclose that this, if they're representing a buyer, they would have to disclose that there's a B&B next door because it's a business, which they can disclose real estate. They can't disclose people, but they can disclose what's going on in the real estate that's next to them. So again, he brought up a good point. It could affect the value of the next door neighbor.
Yep.
I just think there are big differences between somebody renting out a room or two, that they are on the premises, just like I'm a landlord who is next door to my rental unit, so I damn well know what's going on, versus somebody who's an absentee landlord, or versus somebody who's doing these big investment properties. I mean, back in the 80s, companies were buying apartments and using them as places for their employees when they transferred in and out. You know, the whole market has changed greatly, just as Uber and all that stuff. The same thing has happened with these rental things. It's kind of like the OK Corral of everybody's grabbing a buck and we'll see where it all shakes out in another 5 years. But I don't know how you control the 90-day issue, Steve. I've been reading those regs that you can only rent so many days out of the year. Well, who's going to examine whether somebody did 50, 75, or 120? You know, do neighbors need to be informed? I think Russ's point is really good. I agree with the lady in the back here that it's going to be driven into an underground economy if we don't come up with something, but as I said earlier, I'm not sure what that should be. And we are desirable, and that's going to happen.
I have a question about responsibility of the middleman here to the town. And they are the ones collecting the information. They know how many people are doing this in Watertown. Can't they be forced to provide that information to us, you know, to some level?
Boston's regulations actually suggest that that's what they're going to do, but Boston has a much stronger arm than,
of course,
certain
Watertown.
communities.
But if the state takes it on, it's different.
But that's certainly something that we can look at. You know, I think the cooperation of, you know, describe it as the middleman, but of the platforms that are providing that opportunity for the property owners is important. And, you know, having them work with us, and again, at least Airbnb has indicated they want to work with municipalities and they want to have it be above board and be regulated. So at least theoretically, they would be cooperative. Now, some of the other platforms, I'm not so sure, but that's something we can certainly look at as part of this. Yes?
Since there's no sort of regulation now, if I complain to someone, I'm not exactly sure who.
Our zoning enforcement office.
Right, and they go out and decide that this person was using their home, what happens next?
Well,
Do they shut them down?
I would shut down. We would send them a letter telling them that they're not allowed to do that and they need to stop, cease and desist. I suppose your next question would be, well, so then what happens if they just say, nah, I don't care, I'm gonna keep doing it? You know, we would follow up through zoning enforcement and continue to tell them they need to stop, and if they don't, we can fine them.
Oh, you can find them?
Yep.
A woman in Rhode Island in Newport was fined $15,000. Her neighbors got fed up. They reported her. She lives in Hopkinton, absentee landlord, and it's now a big court issue down there.
I'd like to comment on the idea of the number of days being basically a way to kind of limit usage of places, Airbnb, as a non-owner occupied. That would work in encouraging me to not run an Airbnb, because it would be useless for me to rent it 90 days and then find a tenant for the rest of the time. It does channel Airbnb owners towards, okay, I own a place, I'm gonna go away for a month, I'm gonna put it on Airbnb. So I think that would encourage that kind of situation. In terms of the more restrictive you make it, the harder it will be to enforce. I think that's exactly the balance we're talking about here. Because right now, Airbnbs are not allowed in Watertown. They are not allowed, and there are 50 of them, okay? Or, okay, so we don't even know how many.
Right.
So that doesn't work. Now, the idea is if we create some regulations that would encourage, that would give Airbnb operators someplace to go and register, that would bring people up above board and create less of an enforcement issue. But of course, the more lax you make them, then there's more going on that maybe you don't want in your town.
Sure.
But it's, so I think that's exactly the balance. Is if you made it 60 days or 90 days, it's how many people we can get on board and how.
But how do you control for that 90 days then?
Well,
I'm just asking,
well, I don't
as you
know.
do it, so I mean.
Because I'm honest, and when I got a letter, I shut down, and I like running a business that follows
Right,
rules.
yeah.
Okay, so I would look at it and say, okay, 90 days, those are my 90 days.
It gets more complicated.
But
well,
if you want to deal with people who aren't honest, then they're the ones who are running it right now.
Yeah, I know, I'm not
So,
criticizing, I'm just
yeah.
asking the question.
So part of the 60, 90 day, so Cambridge, for instance, in their mechanisms, they have an owner occupied or owner adjacent rule requirement. So this option of a two-family, that's completely, would not be an option anymore in Cambridge.
It's,
So
I
what they-
know several words, so
So,
but it's not.
and it also wouldn't be an option to rent one and use the other one for Airbnb. The only option would be for one to be owner occupied and the other one to be rented. But there's a limitation on the number of days,
Yeah.
so that you don't take away housing stock. That was Cambridge's goal.
Right, and so it's basically so impossible
So-
to
and
work
so-
with that nobody's even gonna bother.
And so another example of this is people, and there's numerous people in Watertown that own more than one home. They own somewhere on the beach and they own somewhere here, or up in the mountains, or whatever it is, and so they may be not in their home for a certain number of days, and so that's where the limitations are. So if they are using it as a second home, but they're only here for, so if they're renting it for 6 months of the year, then that's going too far, is what some of these communities, that's why they're, so it becomes that sort of regulation. If you have the luxury of having more than one home, and it's how much you can rent out that second home in whatever place you're in.
Counselor?
I'm just curious, in terms of that state legislation, the House Bill 3454, is there a corresponding Senate bill, and do you know where it is in the process? Do you know if it's on committee? Do you know if it's on study?
I haven't looked at it recently enough to tell you where it is.
Shoot, he was just here, yeah.
He was here. But well, we can certainly follow up on that and get more information. I certainly want to be much more informed about that if we come before the council with an actual ordinance to say this is how we propose to regulate it. And by the way, this is how the state fits in with that or conflicts with that or whatever. Yep. Councilor?
I just want to thank Steve, his staff, the planning board, the zoning board, because we have an issue here.
Yep.
And we need to find a way to address it, and this is a great beginning to that conversation. And I truly appreciate what your efforts on this, and there are so many concerns here. And the problem is, this is going on today.
Right.
So we can't just say we're not going to address it, or we're not going to accept it, because it's still going to go on. So I do think that,
But Mark, seriously, you can have, you can make the fines
We
big enough.
can have
then
that
you can
discussion
enforce the
later. I
laws.
think this is a beginning,
If we
this
want
is a
to.
beginning of a conversation, and I do think we really have to have this conversation, because it's an issue.
It would be helpful to hear too, more from people that are doing it, because I think it's,
Well,
but to understand.
They don't want to come out,
Virginia.
these two
I know,
people are
they don't.
honest and open, they're here, and they got jammed up.
I know, but it would be helpful to understand what the real situations are, that,
I think one of the important things to note also is that obviously this has been going on for a long time in Watertown. And obviously, there's been an awful lot of that that's going on unnoticed and uncomplained about, and
Right.
it hasn't been an issue for anybody. So, that's certainly worth noting too. Counselor?
So right now, with the current decisions of the planning board, the ZBA,
Yep.
it is illegal, short-term rentals are illegal in
Yes.
Watertown.
Yes.
And so we find ourselves at the sort of this decision point where we've determined legally that they're illegal, and we know they're out there, and we're not taking any enforcement action unless somebody calls and complains.
Yep.
which I think is sort of the worst of all possible situations. If you go online and say, it's 4,500, whatever it is, and we know about it, and we've chosen not to do anything about it, I think that is
Irresponsible.
the worst position we can find ourselves in as a municipality. I think we need to decide, so how many, we have the enforcement, how many fines have we imposed on Airbnb operators in the last 3 years? I would say probably 0.
I think it's probably 0, because I think the ones that we've enforced gone into compliance.
So, I'll just say, so one of the slides you had, New York City and San Diego as 2 places that prohibit Airbnb, the short-term rental. A year ago on Christmas, we rented a house for 5 days in San Diego. And the year before that, we rented a loft in New York City for a week. And both of them were owned by investors. They weren't owner-occupied properties. They were people who specifically bought, one was a single-family house, the other one was a loft in a building. And they bought them specifically, and they had professional management companies manage them. And, for our family, we went there, it was great, it was inexpensive, and it was perfectly fit our needs. The one in San Diego was on a quiet residential street of all single-family houses. So, people are doing it, and so the question we have to ask ourselves is, if we decide we don't want them, we're gonna ban them, it is gonna cost us money. We can't just say we're not gonna enact a use in the zoning ordinance to do it. We are going to have to actually go out and prosecute people who are doing it. Now, how we're going to do that remains to be seen, but it will cost us money as a municipality to do that. And that may mean, going to people's, into people's homes and doing investigations. And I know that there's a lot of concern about sort of the police state tactics to, go into people's houses and say, what are you doing with your property? You can't do that. And we hear a lot about people who are concerned about, enforcement and telling people, what you may want to do or can't do with your own property. So we need to understand that it's going to be a heavy-handed approach if we do that. And we can see from other cities who have prohibited them, it doesn't make it go away. It's still going to occur, it's just going to be driven underground because it's too powerful, it's too much money, too much financial incentive for people to do it. And it will drive it underground and will continue to occur here. So the alternative, if we come to the decision path, is, okay, we're going to allow it, but under certain conditions and regulate it tightly. That's still going to cost us money because we are still going to have, however we end up doing it, inspectors go in and inspect and find out who's complying and who isn't complying. The alternative to that, though, is that we will be able to charge fees to help offset some of that cost. So, but we're gonna, as taxpayers, we're gonna be paying one way or the other to either prohibit it and root them out and stop them, or to actually go in and inspect and charge a reasonable fee for the inspection and the licensing to at least help offset some of that cost. And at least, it gives the people, the honest operators, a path to legitimacy, which may prevent some of it from going underground. There are still going to be the bad apples who, are going to, they don't care. They're going to rent out rooms and basements with no windows. But there's always going to be some element of bad operators. But I think the average person, the average property owner who understands that fines can be assessed against them as a property owner in Watertown. Because the only people who are renting things out are property owners. That they would choose on the side of prudence, that they could do it legitimately and still make a buck versus taking the risk and going underground. But so this is the decision. We're gonna have to make this decision, and we're gonna say, what's, to Russ's point, what's the lesser of the two evils? And I think everybody around us is coming up with certain regulations. The state is proposing certain regulations. Some of them are more stricter than others. We can make it as strict, the regulations as strict or as lax as we want to serve our needs. I like the idea, it's like a home business. If you want to operate a home business, I had this discussion with Gideon earlier. If you're a, psychiatrist and want to see patients in your home as a home business, you need to get a special permit. Your neighbors need to, weigh in a public hearing at the planning board and then a public hearing at the ZBA to get a special permit, and that special permit will limit, hours, the comings and going, removal of the trash, all those kinds of things that people are concerned about. And it's a public process. And if there's enough opposition by the public, the ZBA doesn't grant the special permit for that operation, and then you're up, you are out of luck. And then if people continue to do it, then the zoning enforcement, puts a fine on $1,000 a day for every day that they're in violation. We have an existing structure in place to do that. Maybe that's the lesser of the two evils. I don't know yet. There's still a lot of questions here, but there are risks with banning it, and there are risks with allowing it, and we just need to figure out which is the least risky way to proceed.
Thank you.
I'd like to see a limit, we limit the amount of liquor licenses we give out in Watertown. I think there should be a limit of how many permits that we give out, and then, because otherwise, whole streets can just go,
Okay.
How much, kind of a random question, but does anybody know how much, like, these go for, like a 2-bedroom unit, a standalone unit per night?
I was getting, in the high season, 2-bedroom unit, like 180 to 220 a night.
Mine is about 8 for 1 bedroom.
For 1 bedroom?
I'm sorry, how much?
8.
But she's in her house, he wasn't.
Yeah, for.
Right. No, I'm just curious. And it's kind of interesting, because it does, those prices nightly obviously creates an affordable issue in taking units sort of off the table, but do I dare go out and say that it also enables people to maybe buy 2 families? Because if you can get those kind of rents, that actually might start to subsidize your contribution to the mortgage. I don't know if anyone's noticed, but 2-family prices in Watertown are going like this, and they just keep going up and up and up. And I'm curious, does this have anything to do with it? I own a 2-family. Listen to these prices and the size of the units I have. Rent out both units, and I could probably buy an $8 million house in Watertown with the rents coming in. If I had people, that would be extremely, extremely lucrative.
Did you hear the peak, though? His key was peak, there's a peak season,
I
right?
know.
Yeah.
But, the
I know.
price varies a lot.
But I got 3 bedrooms and 4-bedroom units, so it's like, it's just, it's just interesting. I just kind of like the more information and sort of the more of sharing, and I do want to commend this gentleman. We did have him at the zoning board a couple months ago, and there's very few people that would become involved and get in front of an issue like this. Most people would be, cursing us out, saying, I can't believe they can't let me do what I want to do, but I do commend you, sir, for participating, and it's really nice to have somebody that has experience and understands it and wants to participate in the problem.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
On average, monthly, after commissions and it's about double what I've gotten from a
Right.
renter. And so when we look at this and say, if you don't have enough money to regulate this and enforce it, I'm saying, there's all this extra money being made in Watertown. Watertown should be coming out ahead here. Like I said, taxes, there's plenty there. And that, I would think, would cover the costs of doing this regulation. So regulators, I think quotas make sense. Regulators, registrars, taxes.
Yep. Yes.
And I just would like to, I'm the other Airbnb person in the room, and my experience is different because I'm an owner occupant, and I have rented out 1 room and occasionally 2 over the last 3 years or so. My experience, though it's obviously just mine, has been very positive. I've met lovely people, never had a bad experience. And when I went, I was one of the people, along with Avi, who was outed by someone in Watertown. And so I went I went before the board to try to get a special permit. And before I did that, I went around to all my neighbors and made sure that they knew that I was doing this and wanted to find out how they felt. And none of them knew I was doing it. So, and then most of them were then supportive. So, obviously it varies, and I, more than anything, would want to make sure that what I was doing didn't insult the neighborhood and didn't take the neighborhood in a direction that it didn't want to go. I was a homestay host for many years when my children were younger, and I think that was legitimate. I don't know now, but I did that. And so I became very used to having people in my home and having people come visit, and it has really been an enriching experience. I think that the people who tend to come to someone's home and stay in their home while they're there are a self-selected group of people. I think that just goes without saying. And so they're interested in coming to a place where they can meet somebody. If they're foreign travelers, they want to meet somebody from here, they want to talk, they want to know more.
That's a huge issue, because also we're a major medical center, and families can't afford to stay in hotels for weeks on end. So this is a real service to the community. Then you have the other issue, that somebody has a wild party, somebody's murdered, and that's a whole other story.
Yeah, I do think that there is that distinction. So anyway, just to say that my experience, and I don't know anyone else except for now, Avi, on Airbnb. I don't know who this person is who gave up our names, and I don't know one other host. So, and Caroline just found out.
Well, I just looked on Airbnb. Now, some of those were not in Watertown,
Right.
but when you put in Watertown, 300 came up, but I would say about a third of those weren't Watertown.
Yeah, that's the problem if you're trying to gauge how many are there.
But I was looking
It lists
at those,
outside Watertown.
but
Yeah.
I was
Did you do
looking at
that
what they
thing?
were,
Yeah.
and it looked like there might have been about 200 were in Watertown.
It's a lot.
You have a headache, Steve.
All right, so next steps.
Regulate it.
Yes, but in order to do either one of those things, we need to develop some regulations. So we're going to start to work on that, start to come up with some proposals and bring that back to the town, to the council, and for the planning board to consider and hopefully enact.
Will you have another community meeting, Steve, to talk about the rough draft, so to speak?
Sure, yep.
Great.
Yep, I think that would be our next step, is to craft something, and once we have that, then come back out to the community and say, here's what we thought would make sense, and see what the reaction is.
Cool.
So that will be the next steps, and I'm not sure how long it's going to take, but we will certainly let everyone know when we do that. And again, thank you all for coming out tonight. Really appreciate your participation. Very much.